When Jonathan Miller's son disappeared, he thought his money would solve everything. But instead of finding kidnappers, he found his own son staging a dramatic act to finally be heard. Long-buried family conflicts surfaced, revealing deep wounds and hidden social issues. My solution would surprise even the most experienced. But let's start from the beginning. Jonathan Miller was a man who epitomized the American dream. Coming from a middle-class background, he built his empire step by step. His restaurant chain was known across the country, each location shining with luxury and offering the finest dishes for the elite. Jonathan was accustomed to a life of opulence. Expensive cars, mansions across the country, private jets. Everything he touched turned to gold. But behind all this success lay a harsh truth. His personal life had long lost any meaning. Family became just another formality, an item to check off his long to-do list. Every minute of his day was scheduled. Meetings with business partners, investment deals, discussions of new restaurants. He was used to solving problems quickly and efficiently, with one signature, a few calls, or a hefty sum of money. Those around him knew him as a man who didn't waste time on trivial matters. And in Jonathan's eyes, his son, Michael, had become one of those trivial matters. Michael grew up in luxury, but without his father's love and attention. From a young age, he dreamed of spending more time with his dad, but Jonathan always had excuses. Important meeting. I need to sign a contract. Next time, son. These promises stretched on for years. When Michael was a child, he patiently waited for his father to find time. But as the years passed, this waiting turned into pain and disappointment. He grew up, became independent, but the emotional gap with his father only widened. By the time Michael turned 25, he realized his father didn't even know who he really was. They lived in the same house, but were complete strangers. Michael didn't want wealth. He already had more than enough of that. He didn't need gifts or impersonal birthday greetings from his father. He needed support, the chance to have a heart-to-heart conversation, to feel, even just once, that he was truly heard and valued. Michael repeatedly tried to arrange a meeting with Jonathan. He called him, sent messages, left notes on his desk. Sometimes Jonathan would promise to definitely find time for a meeting, but it always ended the same. Sorry, son, I'm busy. We'll talk later. To Jonathan, these conversations with his son seemed insignificant, almost unnecessary. In his mind, Michael was a spoiled kid who didn't understand how hard his father worked. Jonathan believed that all of Michael's problems could be solved with money. If something bothered his son, a new car or another trip could fix it. The important thing was that Michael wouldn't interfere with business. But Michael begged. He said it was important, that there was something he needed to discuss that had been tormenting him for a long time. Jonathan just brushed him off. Later, Michael. Later. I've got a multi-million-dollar contract. Whatever you want to talk about can wait. From his perspective, any conversation could be postponed because, in the end, money would solve any problem. Jonathan had no idea how wrong he was and how much his behavior was hurting his son. Deep down, Jonathan was convinced he had raised Michael correctly. He had given him everything he himself had lacked as a child. The best schools, expensive education, personal mentors. Michael was so well off that Jonathan believed his son had nothing to worry about. After all, money gave him everything he needed for happiness, and Jonathan had lived his whole life this way. But Michael didn't want money. He wanted a father. A few weeks after Michael's latest attempt to meet with his father was ignored, something unexpected happened. Michael disappeared. That day he didn't come home, and his phone was unresponsive. Jonathan didn't notice right away. His day was, as usual, packed with meetings, business jokes with partners, checking new projects, calls with investors. Coming home late in the evening, he saw that Michael wasn't there, but didn't think much of it. Probably out with friends, he thought, closing the topic in his mind as usual. But the next morning, the situation began to worry even Jonathan. Michael still hadn't shown up. His initial reaction was not deep concern. He saw it as another typical rebellious act. After all, Michael had often gone on his silent strikes when he felt unheard. He's run off for a week or two to make a point, Jonathan thought. Let him cool down, then he'll come back. Life will teach him that Dad was right. Jonathan continued with his business, not paying much attention to his son's absence, considering it a temporary inconvenience. He was confident that his style of family management had never failed. Just wait, and everything would go back to normal. However, when Michael remained missing for a longer period, and no attempts to contact him were successful, Jonathan began to worry. No messages, no calls. This was uncharacteristic even for his rebellious son. Another week passed, and despite all his busyness, Jonathan began to feel nervous. He checked all possible contacts, called his son's friends, but no one knew where Michael was. The unanswered calls made Jonathan feel something new, a shadow of fear. But even that fear was suppressed by his usual rational thinking. It's just a delay. Michael's still upset. He'll come back. Jonathan kept reassuring himself that nothing serious was happening. After all, Michael was just a boy who lacked patience and life experience. But one evening, everything changed. In his office, surrounded by piles of papers and yet another business call, Jonathan received a strange message on his personal phone. A message that made his heart sink. It was a short phrase from an unknown number. "You'll never see your son again." Jonathan felt the ground slip from under his feet. He reread the message several times, trying to grasp its meaning. Panic began to build in his chest, but again, he suppressed it. His instinct was to act, and to act quickly and efficiently. Crisis management was his forte, and he sprang into action immediately. Jonathan didn't break down or give in to emotions. Instead, he began to operate the way he was used to in the business world when his company faced serious threats. He quickly contacted the best detectives, hired top-notch professionals, and organized a search. Simultaneously, he involved his lawyers and people in government circles. Jonathan was certain that money and connections would solve everything, just as they always had in his life. After all, if you had the right resources, you could solve any problem. But this time, things seemed different. Each new day brought disappointment. The detectives found no trace of Michael. All his friends insisted they didn't know where he was, and the phones remained switched off. Jonathan tried involving the police, started negotiations, but all in vain. All this time, a wave of panic was brewing inside him, one he tried in vain to suppress. For the first time in his life, he faced a situation where his money and power offered no guarantees. This feeling of helplessness was new and completely foreign to Jonathan. He was used to overcoming any obstacle with willpower and resources, but now the world he had so carefully built around himself was beginning to crumble. For the first time, Jonathan realized that even he couldn't control everything. A full week had passed since Jonathan received the mysterious message that he would never see his son again. That week turned into a true nightmare for Jonathan. Horrible thoughts swirled in his mind. Who could have kidnapped Michael? What had they done to him? It felt as though every possible and impossible scenario played out in his imagination. During that time, he found no peace. No meeting, no business proposal mattered anymore. His mind was entirely consumed by one thought: find his son at any cost. Never before had Jonathan felt so powerless, despite all his money and influence. On the 7th day of silence, in the evening, just when hope was nearly gone, the phone rang. The number was unknown, but Jonathan answered instantly, without hesitation. A cold voice on the other end said, "If you want to see your son, come to the abandoned warehouse in the industrial zone on the western outskirts of the city. Alone. No police. You have 1 hour." Then the call ended. Jonathan stood frozen, unable to believe what he'd just heard. But time was running out. Without a second thought, he left, not considering that it might be a trap. For his son, he was willing to do anything. The drive took him through the deserted streets of the industrial area, where no living soul had been for quite some time. The silence was oppressive, and the evening twilight gave the scene a menacing tone. Arriving at the warehouse mentioned in the call, Jonathan stopped his car and got out. Anxiety hung in the air. He expected to see criminals or people demanding a ransom. His heart pounded in his chest like never before. All his strength was focused on one thing: bringing Michael back alive. When Jonathan opened the heavy steel door of the warehouse and stepped inside, the first thing he noticed was the darkness and emptiness. There wasn't a soul inside, only the shadows of old equipment and empty crates. But soon, in the far corner of the warehouse, he saw a lone figure. It stood motionless, illuminated by a faint light from a broken window. It was Michael. He stood there calmly, unharmed, as if he hadn't been missing at all. Jonathan froze, unable to believe his eyes. His son was alive. But what did this mean? Where were the kidnappers? He approached Michael quickly, ready to embrace him, but something in his son's expression stopped him. This wasn't the Michael he was used to seeing. His eyes held coldness and bitterness. He didn't move or step forward to meet his father. Jonathan stopped a few feet away and finally broke the silence. "What's going on here? Where are the people? Who kidnapped you?" His voice sounded more confident than he actually felt in that moment. Michael looked at his father silently for a few seconds before speaking. His words dripped with icy fury, barely concealed under a calm facade. "No one kidnapped me, Dad. There are no criminals. This was all my idea." Jonathan stood still, those words sounding surreal at first, incomprehensible. His mind refused to accept the fact that this entire nightmare week was a staged act. What? What are you talking about?" He finally managed to stammer, not believing what he was hearing. Michael took a deep breath and broke the tense silence. "You never listened to me, Dad. You never noticed me. My entire life, I've tried to get through to you, tried to talk, begged for even a little of your time. But you were always too busy, with work, with business, with meetings and contracts. Money and deals were more important to you than I was. You pushed me aside. I became just an accessory to your empire. You thought your money could solve all my problems, but it never solved what I really needed: your attention. So finally, I realized the only way to get you to listen to me was to make you think you'd lost me forever." Jonathan stood frozen, his mind filled with conflicting thoughts. How could he have let this happen? That his son, his only heir, felt so lonely and unwanted. That Michael had been forced to resort to such extreme measures just to get his father's attention. It seemed as if Jonathan's entire world was crumbling in that very moment. To him, everything had always been simple. Money solved everything. But now, he realized the person standing before him was not a boy who could be soothed with gifts or trips, but a grown man who had endured years of neglect and now had to stage this act just to express his feelings. "I put myself in this situation so that you would finally understand what it's like to lose the most important thing," Michael continued. His voice trembled with suppressed emotion, but he stood firm, not lowering his gaze, as though waiting for his father to finally understand everything. "You thought I was gone. You thought money could bring me back. But all I ever wanted was for you to hear me." Jonathan slowly approached his son, unable to believe how his world had been turned upside down so quickly. He finally understood. No amount of money, no network of connections could bring his son back if he lost him for real. Jonathan stood still in front of Michael, realizing the magnitude of his mistake. All this time, he had genuinely believed that by providing his son with everything he needed, he had fulfilled his duty as a father. He had given him everything: the best schools, comfort, wealth that Jonathan himself had had to work for from nothing. But Michael didn't need any of that. Now, looking into his son's eyes, Jonathan understood. Michael wanted something that money couldn't buy: attention, involvement, a father's love. Until this moment, Jonathan had viewed Michael's requests as petty demands, distractions from his important business meetings. He was convinced that his son simply didn't understand the value of time and responsibility that came with running a business. But now, everything fell into place. What had seemed important to Jonathan, contracts, investments, business decisions, lost all meaning in the moment he realized that he had lost the most important thing in life: his own son. Michael didn't want his money, wasn't after his inheritance. He just wanted his father to be there. That meeting in the abandoned warehouse became a wake-up call for Jonathan. For the first time, he saw his son's true emotions. The pain, the disappointment, the years of pent-up resentment. Jonathan couldn't believe he had been so blind all these years. His decision to build an empire for his family had been a lie. He had been building it for himself, substituting genuine closeness with material gifts. That night, for the first time in many years, he realized he had missed the most important thing. On the drive home, Jonathan couldn't stop thinking about how Michael had gone through this extreme experience, not out of greed, not out of a desire for attention, but out of a deep inner void. His son didn't feel like part of the family, didn't feel his father's support, and that, like a knife to the heart, shattered the perfect life picture Jonathan had worked so hard to build. For the first time in his life, he understood that money couldn't buy trust and real connection. He realized that his children, his family, were not just extensions of his business empire. They were his true wealth, which he had long ignored. That evening, when he returned home, everything looked different. The noisy business calls no longer seemed important. For the first time in a long time, he sat in silence, processing how badly his priorities had been distorted. From that moment, Jonathan's life changed. He started by canceling all his meetings for the next few days, and instead decided to spend time with Michael. They talked, really talked. Not about business, not about plans or strategies, but about what truly mattered. Jonathan listened to Michael in a way he never had before. He realized that his son had grown into a man with his own ambitions, desires, and dreams, and that their relationship needed to be rebuilt from the ground up. It wasn't easy, and Jonathan knew that. But for the first time in his life, he was ready. He understood that while money had always been there, true relationships had been absent. His attempts to buy family time and attention with luxury and gifts had failed. He would not only have to change how he treated his son, but also how he treated himself. Each day, their relationship grew stronger. Jonathan stopped controlling every aspect of the business and entrusted Michael with part of the management. He no longer saw him just as his heir, but as a full-fledged partner, someone he was willing to listen to and support. Michael, in turn, began showing a serious interest in the family business, taking on several projects and demonstrating his potential. Instead of being a figurative shadow of his father, he became a full-fledged player, bringing new ideas and perspectives. Jonathan stopped being the man who ran his family the same way he ran his business. He began to build relationships based on trust and respect. Money was no longer his primary currency. Now it was time. Time he spent with his family, conversations with Michael, attention given to each family member. And it was this time that became the wealth he had been deprived of for so long. The meeting in the warehouse became a lesson that changed Jonathan's life. He realized that money could never replace love and true connections with those closest to him. From now on, he was ready to invest not only in his business projects, but also in his family because he finally understood that was his real treasure.